Well, hey there. Welcome to the fifth in our series of 8 blog and live Q&A sessions. My name is Matt Bobbin, and I'm glad that you made it. Before I start here with Elanna, I want to take a second and remind anyone who's watching, that ACL Study Day, Evidence and Practice, the online course that I've been putting together, is launching this Saturday, just a couple days. And I can't believe it's here. We've been working on this course for well over a year now, and it's finally here. I've been putting the final touches on the course, uploading the lectures, and it's looking really good. So if you haven't signed up, we'd love for you to join us. Registration's open now, and the course material will be available starting on Saturday. And in a couple weeks, June 5th, all of our speakers are going to be participating in another live Q&A to answer questions. So another chance to join and interact. All right, so I have Elanna Arhos here with me, and I couldn't be more excited. Thanks, Elanna, for joining.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming and listening, and Matt for hosting this.
Yeah, well, I'm super excited to talk about gait training and some of the really cool research that you're working on at the University of Delaware. But before we do that, could you just tell me a little bit about your lab and the research team that you're part of and what you guys are about?
Yeah, so I'm at the University of Delaware, like Matt said. I'm in my 3rd year of my PhD here, and I just recently proposed my dissertation work, so I'll be doing mostly dissertation credits from here on out. So our lab largely focuses on ACL rupture, ACL injury, and prevention, gait mechanics. So when I first came here, we had just kind of finished up a trial called ACL Sports, which was specialized postoperative return to sport training. And one of our primary outcome measures, besides return to sport measures, was gait mechanics. So through kind of the tail end of that work, I started to realize that, what we were doing was helping, but there's still all these changes in gait mechanics that were looking like they were leading to some pretty negative downstream effects. And I was just really interested in, we've kind of started throwing interventions at this problem, but have we really fully understood where this problem comes from and why is it there? So that's what kind of led me into more looking at the central nervous system and adaptability and all that kind of stuff.
That's pretty cool. So who's there in your lab with you?
So right now, no one, but usually there's actually so when I came, I was with Jacob Capon, who's a postdoctoral fellow at University of Colorado now, Celeste Dix, who's now doing her sports PT residency at UD, Jessica Johnson, who is faculty at the University of Minnesota, and then a PhD student named now Ido just joined us about, I guess not just, but a little bit back after his DPT here at UD, and he's working on some graft site morphology. So he will be an interesting one for you to follow up with too for this series, I'm sure.
Cool.
So yeah, it's kind of dwindled to just the two of us now, but still going strong.
That's great. Okay. All right. Well, you had a really interesting blog, and we got a couple questions about it. So I think we could get into it. And I think the first question that I'm curious about is, why is this just now being studied?
Yeah, I laughed at that question too. It's a great question. I think this is the case with a lot of more neuro implications behind orthopedic injuries. I think that we're more and more starting to consider the neuromuscular system and the effects of musculoskeletal injury to the neuromuscular system. So for me, and kind of the reason that it's just now being studied for me, is that when I did my DPT at St. Louis University, I was working with a researcher there, Gretchen Salsik, who was really interested in looking at some motor learning strategies with patellofemoral pain. So that kind of started getting my wheels turning about motor learning and its application in the orthopedic world, and why we don't utilize those concepts more. In my program and in a lot of programs, I see it taught very separately. It's like the neuro curriculum and the orthopedic curriculum, and you don't really get that cross collaboration of how can our strategies that work well in the other population help patients in the orthopedic population and vice versa. So I do think in general it's an upcoming topic. I think often when interventions and things stop working or not giving us the effects that we want as a researcher, you kind of start to go back into a more mechanistic mindset of, can we figure out the why behind this? So it was kind of a natural step in that direction for me.
That's pretty cool. Okay. So is this, I think this question made me kind of laugh too. Why does this need to be investigated specifically? I think, we're humans. I mean, we make plastic changes. Why does this need to be investigated specifically?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think especially with gait, we are humans. We do make plastic changes. However, we don't know how that system in which we make plastic changes changes. I was trying to search for a better word there, but how that system gets impacted by a musculoskeletal injury. So, for example, an ACL injury, you're losing some of your afferent feedback back into the central nervous system. We might not be able to just make that plastic change as easily after an injury like that as you would be as a healthy, otherwise uninjured individual. So that's kind of the why study it. And the second part of that is that we're trying to change these mechanics in real time in the clinic, and we don't really know if these mechanics are something that do respond to adaptation or plasticity. So it's kind of a step back of like, hold on, is this something we can change? How well can we change this compared to a healthy individual? And that's I think that's a good answer to that. Very smooth transition there.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think about different ages of people and gait training? Is like a 14 or a 16-year-old have, do you think they have better adaptability than like a 34 to 36-year-old? Their brains are different, I think.
Yeah, that's a good question. That actually came up a little bit during my proposal too. Currently, there hasn't been a lot of evidence on age with adaptation, and to be completely transparent, a lot of what I'll talk about is kind of being pulled from where split belt treadmill training has been, which has primarily been post-stroke. And so in that case, you're seeing individuals who are on the later side, and they're all able to adapt, certainly to a lesser extent than healthy individuals, but they still show that they have abilities to adapt. In terms of younger individuals, I include 13 and older in my study. So that's one of the patient characteristics we'll be looking at, because a lot of the stroke studies have not gone that low age-wise. So it'll be interesting to see. I would anecdotally say that children and young adults are probably maybe a little bit more prone to having plastic changes than older adults, but
yeah, old dogs, new tricks.
Exactly.
Okay. So I think in your blog you said you've collected data on 7 individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mostly
what are the ages?
pilot data.
Okay.
So we've gone as low as 13. We have one who's 13, and then as high as 30. And I qualify that as mostly pilot data because it took a while to kind of figure out exactly what paradigm I'm going to use. And I can kind of talk through my decision making for that too. But yeah, 13 to 30 was the range-ish.
Yeah, tell me about that. So pilot data is like what, like proof of concept, or just to basically talk about that a little bit,
exactly.
would you?
Yeah, so it's primarily proof of concept for us. So a lot of the stroke literature had looked at adaptation of parameters like step length and stance time, step width. A lot of people hadn't looked at actual joint angles and their adaptation parameters. So the first question was, in healthy people, aka in all the PhD students I could find, like, is this something that I can get to adapt before I trial it on somebody who's in an ACL? So I did a lot of healthy participant collection and then moved into the 7 ACLs. So then the other questions we had were really like, I think the simple one that first came up was, what about just walking faster? Like if you're trying to make one leg faster, why don't we just make the participant walk faster? That's certainly more clinically relevant and easier to implement in a clinic. And so some nice data has come out since then that has shown that actually when we encourage individuals to walk faster, they become more asymmetric. And we're seeing that that's because their ACL reconstructed limb is stiff and it's not as responsive to the change in the speed as the uninvolved limb. And so then you're kind of taking these people out of what they would self-select as their efficient walking pattern. And that probably plays into it too. And so they become even more asymmetric at a faster speed than they would be just at their self-selected speed too.
Okay. When you say they're stiffer, they can't kind of sort of cushion that initial contact as well. Is that what you're thinking? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So they have a stiffer knee at initial contact. They have lower joint moments, so lower forces going through that knee joint. And yeah, they don't change. So the uninvolved limb, will start flexing more and kind of putting more load through it to adapt to that increase in speed. But the ACL reconstructed limb stays the same, is what we're seeing.
Okay. Does this is just an aside because you mentioned lower knee moments very casually, and I think whenever I read biomechanical studies, it takes me like twice as long, I think, than other studies because I'm always trying to get the moments and the excursions and all the different things. And you guys use so many abbreviations. Does it get easier when you read?
It definitely does get easier, but I think it just helps to. I don't know. I just always think of moments as like just the force of the muscle, the sum of the forces of the muscle that it's exerting on that joint. So an internal or also termed external extension moment is really talking about the quadriceps force at the joint. So. Okay.
So Liz Wellsant did a couple talks for the course coming out this weekend, and I haven't gotten a chance to go through it in its totality, but there's definitely a picture of Isaac Newton in one of her talks, which I think is pretty awesome. So so we'll get some good biomechanical love there, some good physics love. So are there groups of people who recover normal gait mechanics without intervention?
There are. So you don't see this in everybody. We don't, in our ACL sports trial, we didn't see that everybody either had really asymmetric gait or really symmetric gait. And we've kind of tried to dive into that a little bit. I've tried to look to see if there's any clinical factors that might differentiate those with really asymmetric gait versus those that are more symmetric. Like maybe do they have more confidence, lower fear? Are they stronger? And so certainly strength, we know strength early on plays into it. And so those that are probably stronger earlier after surgery or regain their strength quicker and lose that effusion quicker or reduce their pain quicker, I would, again, anecdotally say are probably going to walk better than those who do not. And then we know copers and non-copers. That's an example of two groups that have very different gait mechanics. So that's not ACL reconstructed, but those without ACLs, ACL deficient individuals, and copers do walk a lot better than non-copers in that population too. So you see the subgrouping, and I don't know that we know exactly why beyond some of the things that we can kind of infer from research right now.
Mm-hmm. How about different injuries? Some people have two or more, three ACL injuries. Do you think those people recover their gait more or worse or faster, slower?
I would probably venture to say not as well as those who it's their primary ACL, just because there's probably a whole concoction of other stuff going on with those folks. But that is a limitation of some of our work, is that we exclude people who have re-injured in the past. So it's we have all primary ACL ruptures in our gait literature.
Okay. I think if we're talking joint, trauma to the joint as being a deafferenting experience, I guess that would be multiple, insults to a joint.
To the capsule, depending on how it's managed too, definitely.
Okay, next question. So you stay improved. This is I think quoted from the post. Improved gait mechanics from perturbation training are not maintained when administered postoperatively. Isn't that the focus of your study? It seems a little bit. I think there's maybe a little bit of context lacking.
Yeah, sure. When we talk about perturbations, it's a little bit different in those contexts. So perturbation training at the University of Delaware, when we did all these studies, is people that stand on platforms. So they'll stand on a rolling board, a rocking board, and a platform board, and they get perturbations given to their stance leg, versus this perturbation is a perturbation from the belts being split. So same word, but different context there. So perturbation training was something that we added into pre and post-operative care in order to see if we can kind of target some of those gait asymmetries, just to target the sensory motor aspects of muscle and try to see if we can enhance that. So what early work, I think this was like probably a good 10 years ago now from our lab, found that after preoperative physical therapy, the perturbation training did improve gait mechanics. So we were all, as if I was there. I was not there. It's probably like in middle school, but they all thought that, this might be something that, I guess I should rewind and say that the effects were then lost after these individuals underwent ACL reconstruction. So then their next line of thinking was, okay, then maybe we should make this a post-operative intervention too, and see if we can see some of those same effects. And that's where we noticed that ACL reconstruction actually made it worse, and the gait effects didn't last after that. I honestly can't remember the beginning of that question now. I feel like I just started tangenting.
That's okay. No, the question was the state you stated in your paper that the improved gait mechanics from perturbation training are not maintained when administered postoperatively. But I think we determined it's a different type of perturbation. Yeah. Sorry, go back into the first perturbation. So you mentioned moving plates.
Yeah. So there's kind of, and this is probably will take a lot of time to explain this. So there's a lot of research I can point people to if they're interested in it, but it's basically a 10-session program that had a rocker. I don't even know how to explain. A rocker board is like a tilt board in the clinic that you stand and do balance training on, a rolling board that had wheels underneath it that you could kind of control like that. And then just a platform, which was just the first stage. It just sat.
Okay.
So what the clinician would do is kind of give small amplitude perturbations to the surface. And so the patient would have to respond and not contradict the perturbation, but keep the board in the same place.
They have to counter it. Okay. Yeah.
Counter it. Yes.
They have to work with it. Okay.
And my brain's not used to late night conversations about science.
Great. Let's see here. Hang tight. Entertain the group here for 1 second.
I could entertain. I don't really even know who's here. It doesn't show me that anywhere.
Sorry. Okay. All right. Next. So I'm going to ask you about osteoarthritis, post-traumatic osteoarthritis. How strong or causal is the relationship between aberrant knee joint mechanics and the development of post-traumatic OA?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It's not a direct causal link. We don't have, I should say, there isn't strong evidence that says it's this direct causal link. I think it's a piece of the puzzle in terms of just joint health. So briefly, the overarching theory with this is that the way that you walk after your ACL reconstruction with the stiffer knee gait, so decreased knee flexion, lower joint moments, it kind of positions your knee so that you're walking on basically different parts of the cartilage that aren't used to sustaining this load that you would normally have in cyclical gait. So Liz Wilson, actually, that you mentioned, published some work on this from our lab that was kind of counterintuitive to what you normally would expect, and that you would think that higher loads are actually going to make you kind of break down that cartilage more. But she found that underloading, so kind of this U-shaped relationship, is also damaging that cartilage too. Yeah.
I will say that the title of her talk, one of her talks in this course coming up is was it long-term, post-traumatic arthritis, long-term ? Consequence of ACL injury, which got me thinking here. So, so I read the paper came out last December, and it was Mackenzie White, who's our next blogger, and Lindsay Lepley, and then there was another guy whose name I can't remember in it, and they did a rodent model, and I only read the abstract, but they were pretty confident that knee joint mechanics was a causative factor of OA, and they observed OA pretty soon into the process. It was a rat, but I thought that was pretty interesting. At least, are you familiar with that study?
No, I actually haven't read that one, but I will have to look into it. But we have some engineer colleagues who are looking at gait mechanics also, and they're also looking at MRI biomarkers. So I'm not an expert in any of that, but I do know that they're finding pretty early signs of OA development that are related to the way that people are walking. So as a training scientist, I'm careful about making strong statements like that, but I do think that we have enough evidence to really point us in that these gait mechanics are something of pretty significant interest. And the other big thing that I think about is that this is one of the more modifiable components that we can target. So when you think about the risk factors for OA, like a lot of them are non-modifiable, or at the time that you get them, non-modifiable, right? Like if they had a concomitant chondral injury or any sort of meniscal injury, we know that they're at a higher risk, but that's not anything you can change anymore. So gait mechanics are of interest in that sense too, because the more we understand how they affect that development of OA, the more that we can clinically hopefully start to develop some interventions that will target that too.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's. So I'm not a scientist. I'm a clinician, and so I'm big into speculation here. So I'm going to ask you to speculate a little bit here. What stage of rehab would you suspect an ACL patient to be most receptive to motor adaptation?
So this is a good question, and one that we've kind of not struggled with, but talked a lot about as we started to define what our patient population is going to look like for this study. I would, out the bat, I said right away, like, let's get these people in right away, because I think that the whole reason that these gait mechanics exist in the first place is the way that is this learned walking pattern from immediate post-op, where you are swollen and painful, and it's how you start walking, and it's use-dependent learning, and you adapt to this pattern. That being said, so there's this whole thing in motor learning where it's performance versus actual learning. And so you have to kind of distinguish, can they perform the task versus is their inability to properly perform the task what's influencing their ability to learn or not learn. So that being said, I think that in my study, we've kind of thought about, like, let's get people past that stage where they are swollen. Let's get their fusion down. Let's get their pain levels down. Let's get them ideally walking better clinically, and then get them strong enough to where we know that strength is a factor in aberrant gait mechanics. So let's get them strong enough to where we know that strength isn't the primary driving factor. So that's why we chose kind of a 3-month time point for that, arbitrarily, thinking that that's when most people are starting to consider return to run programs and that kind of thing. That's the science side of me, just saying, here's a tight-knit group of people we can test where we kind of take away some of those effects. But I would be really interested in timing too. Like, do people adapt better right out the gate? Yeah. Do they adapt better mid-rehab, or do they adapt better a year or two down the road?
Yeah, I think the study that you cited, the one that it looked at, I think, spatiotemporal components of gait in ACL patients, they were all like 3 years post-op.
Yeah, so they were, and that was another thing I noted with that study. I think that study was really helpful to kind of get the ball rolling on looking at things like this. And it allowed me to kind of take the next step of, okay, they can adapt these spatiotemporal parameters to a lesser extent than healthies, but how about the ones that are specific to what we see after ACL reconstruction? But yeah, they were a little bit longer, which again, if you're thinking use-dependent learning and plasticity, you're thinking that then, like, that's even more of a motor pattern that it's ingrained into who you are, and how now you've been functioning out in the real world, probably in sport and that kind of thing, with this gait pattern already.
Yeah. So what are your strength inclusion criteria? What are all the things you're looking at on your current study that you're working on? Yeah.
So we don't have a strength inclusion criteria, which, if you know the University of Delaware ACL lab, is shocking because we're a quads are queen and king lab. But the reason for that is that we started recruiting from external sources, and not everybody measures strength the way that we do. And so we really wanted to be able to include homogenous people, but people not just from UD. So that's why we kind of termed that being verbally cleared by a healthcare provider to run. So we're hoping that there's some sort of measure of strength that some clinicians are using to help qualify that return to run. That's definitely a hope. But we are collecting. So when they come into me, we're doing the GATE study, and then we're also collecting a host of clinical outcome measures. So we're looking at active joint position sense for proprioception. We're looking at quadriceps strength index. We're looking at effusion, joint range of motion, and then a couple of patient-reported outcome measures too. So I'm really hoping to be able to categorize like those people in my sample that do well and don't do well by some of that stuff.
Oh, well. So you're collecting all that data. You're just not not saying, oh, if you're whatever, if you don't meet this criteria, you can't participate. Everyone's participating. It's just then you're sort of getting an idea of what they're doing or how they're.
That was our best way to kind of circumvent some of the strength cutoffs and that kind of stuff for inclusion. But yeah, we're burst testing them. So we'll also have a central activation ratio. So we'll be able to see how much they're activating what they've got too, which will be helpful.
Okay. This question just came in. I'm just going to read it out loud. Does our early objective criteria need to be improved upon to ensure task equals capacity early on to subsequently ensure optimal motor learning when retraining gait? It's a very specific
good question. It is specific, but it's good. And I think that is like, when you're thinking about learning as an outcome in your rehab, it is something that I think ultimately, yes, but I don't know that that's as feasible right now as just ensuring, that like you're clinically kind of separating, is the issue for them not being able to learn this new movement pattern or carry this new movement pattern over to new context? Is that issue because they're having a hard time with performance of that movement pattern, or is that issue because they have a deeper learning issue going on, which is kind of what I'm trying to study too, and what we're still trying to understand about ACL injured individuals. Like, do they have a deeper learning issue going on? And there's so many different mechanisms of learning, which I feel like I learn about a new one every single day, like reward learning and error-based learning and all this stuff. So I think ultimately, yeah, it would be great to be able to do that. But right now, I think it's just a good thing to keep in mind clinically, just to think about as you're kind of looking at transfer of motor learning and all that.
So you mentioned different types of learning. The type of learning you're studying is error-based, right? That's what perturbation training is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Adaptation is largely error-based. So it's really just adjusting or fine-tuning, modifying, not fine-tuning, like an already learned behavior or motor skill. So it's trial and error process for adaptation. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's how children learn how to walk and run and ride bikes, right?
Yeah. And that's why this perturbation that we're talking about from the split belt is really just a perturbation enough to create an error in the central nervous system. So, and then we're looking at how we react to that error. So it needs to be an error that's big enough to perturb the system in that sense.
How much attention do you let people pay to the belt and their legs while they're walking, while they're either training or where you're gathering data? Do you distract them? Or you just let them like walk quietly?
So I just kind of give a very general cue of like, I don't tell them what's going to happen. I just say like, your legs are going to move at different speeds. I want you to just focus on like, look straight ahead, kind of focus on walking. Don't think about it. Don't think about what's happening. Don't try to change what's happening. And in that case, I just usually talk to them. Like a lot of them are younger athletes, kind of my age. So just talk about, a lot of them are University of Delaware students. So I have some people who will like look down a lot because it is a pretty startling perturbation. It definitely it perturbs your system pretty good. So I have some people that like look down right away, and I try to say to them, don't look at your feet, don't look at what's going on. It's not everybody's favorite feeling right away.
No. Yeah. What's it like when you get off the treadmill and you're walking on solid ground?
It's it depends on how you
do you walk in circles?
It's pretty weird. Yeah, you just start walking really fast in a circle. No, we are looking at overground transfer in this study. So in the first phase, we're going to have them fully wash out their So they're going to learn a new gait pattern when the belts are split, and then they'll fully wash the gait pattern out while the belts are going the same speed again. And then I'll have them readapt, so do the split again to see if that's faster. So if they learned anything in the short term or retained anything. And then rather than an immediate washout on the treadmill, I'm taking them over ground. So they just start walking over ground to see if there are any effects that are maintained in a transfer of environment there too.
Okay. And so you have instrumented treadmills and you have motion capture, and are you just like flooded with data by the time you're done with the trial or session?
It's a lot of data. Yeah. And I mentioned that I just did my proposal for my PhD, and like that's something me and my committee and I talked about, is just there's a lot of stuff that we can look at. Right now, my primary variables of interest are really those knee mechanics and what they're doing, and there's certain ways that we can measure the amount of adaptation, so we can actually take that as a percentage of the amount learned, so that we're not comparing. Some people might just learn a lot more than others. So there's some primary things that I'm looking at, but also like you said, there's so much data, and we even thought about like throwing on EMG, and things just got a little out of hand with that discussion. But if I had all the time and didn't have to graduate and resources in the world, I would love to throw on some other stuff to look at too. But
cool. Yeah. That's great. So you mentioned there's been some perturbation training research in, like, I think you said stroke, and I think there might have Parkinson's as well, maybe.
Split belt training.
Split belt. So what are the effective doses, and how long are changes seen?
So in terms of dosage, I think there's actually some really interesting new data on this, but it's kind of similar to my paradigm. So people will say about 10 minutes is what you need to adapt to the split, and then another 10 minutes to wash yourself out from that. Long-term effects is where it gets a little sticky depending on the study. We have some post-stroke studies that have shown that there's a transfer over ground, but none of these studies have really shown any long-term positive changes from this. So even the stroke research has kind of moved away from looking at the split belt as something that will be a direct intervention for these patients, and more as something to just kind of help, a clinical tool to help just understand what's happening here. And so that's the biggest thing I think we can glean from that, is it'd be great to see overground changes and transfer, and what that's going to point to us is that, this type of learning is effective in ACL injured individuals, and that they can do this. It is something, though, at this time that I don't know that we're comfortable making the statement that it would be an interventional tool. Right now, we're really looking at it just to kind of assess central nervous system adaptability.
So when you're looking for these adaptable changes, you're not like, is there a certain characteristic gait your goal is, or because you're not trying to fix their gait, right? When you're working on these, you're just trying to see if they can learn a new pattern and does it stick, right? So what's the goal? How do you know how much to mess with them?
So when you think about, I wish I had some of my data I could pull up pretty quick, just to show like a graph of it. But basically what happens is that the initial perturbation, you get this pretty big split. So you have, like, if you're looking at our primary outcome measure is usually asymmetry index. So it's a measure of symmetry between the two legs. So you're looking at like a pretty high asymmetry index here. And then as they adapt and they start learning, the asymmetry between the limbs starts to decrease and then level off. And so that they start to go either back towards their initial asymmetry, so it's not this large one, or even towards no asymmetry and a more symmetric gait pattern by the end. And that's how we've measured that they've learned something, because despite this mechanical split in the belts, they are now walking symmetrically again, or their version of symmetry that they came in with. And what has been really neat that we've seen, never thought I'd like use the word neat in a sentence, but what's been like pretty cool that we've seen is that some people that come with this large asymmetry actually start to level off, and get even more symmetric by the end of the split belt period than they were when we did their baseline session. So that's really showing us that, like, hey, this big error, like perturbation to the central nervous system that we're giving them, it might be a big enough error to kind of cause this readjustment of what their normal baseline is. So that's just something, we're keeping our eyes on, because it's a pretty unique effect. They're not just adapting back to their normal walking speed, or walking asymmetry, but they're actually getting a little bit better.
So maybe it does have some clinical, interventional application.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely don't want to discount that. I just think that right now we're a little bit far away from saying, like, oh, everybody go buy a split belt, like this is going to be great. Yeah. But I think what it does show us is that they do have the ability to start walking symmetrically again. And that's something we didn't really know, right? Like, we just have seen these people with these asymmetries that might level off, might not, but we're not seeing that they can actually go back to walking symmetrically. So seeing that they can do that and they have that ability, when we talk about the performance, is a really cool effect that we didn't expect to start seeing.
Yeah. Well, how much is a split belt? It can't be more than like $250,000, right?
Easy, right? Well, I feel like we should just start some. I would start advocating for handheld dynamometers probably in the clinic first, and then we'll move into the split belts.
Right, I know. Yeah. Yeah, but there's like there's companies who do, they take something that's like research grade and they make it a little bit more appealing for the clinic. Like, you can get you can get them on your phone now, motion capture.
Definitely
software.
The Dorsify and all that too. Honestly, I don't know that a non-instrumented split belt treadmill would be maybe a little bit more expensive than a normal one, but I think we've still got a lot of ways to go before but there are some people that have or use split belts just for I think a lot of research labs are starting to buy them, not to do split belt treadmill training, even though it's the coolest thing, but to use it just because you're able to read individual limb contributions rather than on a normal instrumented treadmill. You can't really associate what's coming from what leg because they have individual motors and speeds and force plates too.
Cool. Okay, here's a clinical question. In theory, do you think we could get the same results from randomly adjusting a metronome while a patient or client is on a normal treadmill?
Yeah, I thought about this question a lot. I think so. There's a PhD student here that's more in the motor learning space and neurospace, and he's studying just different learning mechanisms. And something that they were looking at is actually like some visual feedback. So similar to what you're suggesting, but obviously visual instead of auditory. But they have basically like these markers of step length that adjust. And so they have, the target goes up so that they're making people take a bigger step just by using the visual target. And they are finding that people are learning pretty well just by using that type of strategy. So metronome potentially, I think some sort of visual biofeedback is probably like, even if you could show like project like here are the knee angles, try to make this knee angle even bigger than what you're already doing. Like you're doing 18 degrees, try to get it to 23 degrees, something like that could be a really cool next step too.
Yeah. Or like this is gonna date me. Like Dance Revolution. You probably don't know what that is.
Yeah. DDR. I know.
You do. Sorry. You got like the right leg is like coming down and the left leg is coming down and you got to hit right on the beat. That's like a metronome with a visual cue and then they're spaced differently.
Yeah, exactly. Something like that. I think all that kind of real-time biofeedback is going to be the next, that's the way that we can bring this into the clinic, any of this kind of work.
Yeah. I mean, I think we should get started right away developing this technology.
Me too. I actually would love to play DDR again. That's how I picture like my dance moves again after COVID, since it's been a while. I'm going to have to be like automated, like right step, left step.
Okay. So here's more questions about your post here. What can you describe the difference in slow adapting and fast adapting gait changes, and what does it tell us about new learning?
Yeah, definitely. So fast adapting gait changes are, I wouldn't call them even adaptive or adapting. It's more termed reactive. So they're the gait parameters that you have to change because of the split immediately so that you don't fall. So you're going to kind of make these changes. They're going to last the whole entire time that you're doing walking on the split belt, but they're not going to be something that stick after. So when we talk about the after effects in when you go back to a normal walking period, the fast reacting or changing gait parameters don't. But then the slow adapting parameters, so like step length and gait, hopefully knee angles, that's something that it becomes learned and consolidated over the period of the split belt perturbation. So I think of it as a reactive change so I don't fall versus something that I'm changing in order to make my movement more efficient and bring me back to symmetry again.
Okay. And so, okay, so I gotcha. That's nice and clear. All right, so here's a question about deafferentation. So, so if deafferentation is partially driving the lack of ability to adapt, what strategies can clinicians use to specifically help this early in the rehab effort? And I know we talked about this before we came on, and I'm just going to give you free rein here to speculate and to be, just whatever comes to mind. What do you think?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a tough question. I think this is kind of the question we all have is how do we account for the fact that we're losing these mechanoreceptors and we're having this deafferentation. So one thing that I actually talked with Meredith, who previously did a blog, and we just were kind of talking about how with deafferentation, you really want to focus on upweighting the somatosensation and downweighting any sort of vision or vestibular contributions. So that might look like no increased reliance on any visual compensation when you're doing exercises, and no like compliant surfaces right away, but really focusing on somatosensation first. That's one way that we can kind of start to try to train that part of our sensory system in isolation. But I think that that's something that is still being looked at a lot. Like I know that there's some research on ICE and on NMES and sensory TENS to kind of try to help simulate that sensory environment. But that's kind of the best I got on that question. I think early on that proprioception is the first thing that you kind of lose. And right now we don't have a great way of measuring that. And we also don't have a great way of intervening on that. And so I think that's a big lacking area of ACL research and practice too.
Okay. So, and I think the jury's kind of still out on how much afference you can gain over time, right? Whether or not the graft. I think I read that some of the grafts do show, sensory fibers, and but the whole thing's still kind of a mess, right? It's not like real clear. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, right now, grafts don't help to restore any of those mechanoreceptors that you lose from your native ACL. So I say right now because you never know, and there's some pretty cool stuff going on. So it could be that some of these other, like the BEAR trial, the bridged, I can't remember, bridge enhanced, I can't remember what it stands for. It's been
Sounds
tested
good.
mostly in children, but that, potentially that helps with proprioception. But yeah, right now there's not really much that the reconstruction does to help that.
It's very interesting. Well, I think that Meredith, when she said it, she was part of our second blog and Q&A, and she talked about having like a broken sensory motor system or something to that effect. And that really stuck with me. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. And something
it's nothing that I'd really considered it sort of to that degree up until she said it, which is great.
Yeah.
She's pretty smart.
Yeah. Pretty smart gal.
Well, let's keep it kind of speculative here. What do you see as the future of this type of assessment and treatment in the clinic? And what, do you see us using motion capture to assess gait, things like that in the future? That's intrigued, I should say.
In general, so non-specific to the split belt type of motion capture, I think that we're getting closer and closer to being able to assess things like that clinically. I think markerless motion capture systems that are starting to pop up, they need a little bit more research and a little bit more trialing, but that kind of thing, IMU devices, anything like that, I think we're getting close to being able to use some of that to measure joint mechanics in the clinic. Theoretically, it'd be great if everybody could get a gait assessment. However, if we don't catch up on the what are we going to do about it side, so we can pick these people out, right, which we still aren't fully able to do, but we need to be able to understand how we can intervene also. So I think for me, that's kind of where I see my research fitting in. I see it as another answer to how are we learning, how's the neuromuscular system impacted, is the central nervous system part of the reason why our interventions aren't working. And motor learning is really a component, or motor adaptation, I should say, is really a component of motor learning. And so I kind of view it as a little bit of a peek inside into even how good are our abilities to learn or have to learn after ACL rupture. So all these motor learning interventions that we're starting to do, are they going to stick in the long run? Are they going to be beneficial in the long run? And we see some promising data for some of that. But yeah, that's where I kind of see the future clinically of this kind of research doing. But it is still, there's still a lot of questions we have. Unfortunately, it's still a couple studies away probably from being something I can say, go do this Monday morning in the clinic, even though I love to hear that kind of stuff when I go to talks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's nice to have something actionable and really ready to implement right away. But here we are. So that's pretty much all of our questions. I found this study that I was talking about. It was Mackenzie White and Ross Branconti and Lindsay Lepley. And
Okay.
the title is Relationship Between Altered Knee Kinematics and Subchondral Bone Remodeling in a Clinically Translational Model of ACL Injury. I can email you the link here after we finish here. But I thought that was interesting. And it's especially, I think to me, it's especially impressive is that they were able to injure rat ACLs.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I know. That's awesome. That's super interesting. I'm excited to read that paper.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I think we covered kind of all of the bases here. Do you want to just is there anything that maybe you wanted to talk about your post or your research that wasn't covered?
Not really. I think that covered a lot of it. I'm excited that people are interested in learning about this. I'm learning with you. This is, one of the first times that a lot of research is starting to look at these kind of things. I thought it was really cool that a lot of this blog series was focused on the more neuro implications of ACL injury. And I don't know if that was intentional or not, but I think it's really awesome to see what some of the past blogs are doing. And I think, we're all kind of attacking this question from a different angle. And so I think a lot of our research efforts will kind of hopefully steer us in a new direction because as we know, there's still so many negative consequences to these injuries, so many more and more downstream effects we're seeing in terms of developing arthritis. So any way that we can figure out a different path to take or a different way to answer some of these questions is awesome.
Yeah. I will say that it's definitely deliberate that I set up the blog series in this way. It's not just that you guys responded to my emails. I'm just kidding. No, this definitely sort of fits my bias is to sort of think about ACL and rehab in general and these frameworks. So no, I'm really happy that you responded to my email and wrote this really great and interesting blog post. I hope that when you get more data and you can and you have more to say, I would love for you to maybe do a follow-up or whatever your time or energy allows for as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So so I think that's going to be it. Anyone who's watched this and made it this far, I'll just remind you that we have we're going to take a little break from the blogs. We did have Christy Zawalski. She was going to put out a blog next week. Some things came up, so we rescheduled it, which is actually kind of nice for me because I get a couple of weeks of off. But we do have the course coming out this weekend, and then Mackenzie White has a blog coming out, and that will be I will tell you right now, that'll be June 12th. That'll be coming out, and I'll ask her about how you injure a rat ACL. I'll ask her directly. So it's her that's her publication. So, yep. And you're joining the ACL Study Day course that's starting this weekend. So I appreciate you jumping on, and I hope anyone else watching jumps on as well. And that's it. So thank you so much, Elanna.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt, and thank you for the opportunity to be able to talk about my work. I just would like to say to whoever is still listening, any questions or thoughts or comments, I'm happy to chat with you and field them. It's fun to talk about this kind of stuff. So yeah, thanks again.
Yeah. What's the best way to contact you?
My email is there. If I type it in this chat, does it go? Or
try it. Let's see.
It's my first initial, so E, and then my last name, Arhos at udel.edu. And then obviously also Twitter. Any way that you reach out to me via Twitter, I can also email. And
all right, I'll repost it because you posted it just to me. But okay, so there is Elanna's email.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Please email her, and that's great. All right, well, you have a great rest of your night.
Okay, right on. Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Bye.